The wagon wheel caught in a rut, the jolt traveling up through the worn seat and into Martha's bones. She didn't flinch. For 3 weeks, the rhythm of the trail had been her only companion, a steady, punishing beat that matched the hollowness in her chest. The letter, folded and creased into a soft square in her shirt pocket, had been simple. A brother she hadn't spoken to in 2 decades was dead. He'd left her his claim in the Montana territories, 40 acres of timber and rock, a cabin, and whatever was in it. The lawyer in Dusty Cheyenne had called it an inheritance. Martha called it a final address. A place to stop moving. The horse blew out a long breath, and she let the reins go slack, letting the animal find its own way up the last of the rise. Through a break in the pines, she saw it. The cabin wasn't abandoned, it was surrendered. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, and the porch listed to one side. A single window stared out like a blind eye. It was a place a man came to be forgotten. She understood the impulse. She pulled the wagon to a halt near a half-collapsed lean-to. The air was sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a clean smell that felt alien after the close, grieving air of the small room she'd left behind. For a year, she had watched her husband waste away, the big, capable man shrinking until he was just a flicker of pain in a bed. When he was gone, the silence he left was bigger than he had ever been. She had sold their small ranch, paid their debts, and was left with 2 good horses, a wagon of essentials, and an emptiness so vast it had its own geography. Then the letter about Frank had arrived. A ghost from a life she'd buried long ago. A low whine came from the back of the wagon. She turned. An old German shepherd lay on a pile of blankets, his head raised. One of his eyes was clouded milky blue, the other a sharp, intelligent brown. His muzzle was white with age, and when he tried to stand, his back legs trembled. The lawyer had said the dog came with the property. His name is Gunner, the man had said, as if that explained the soul-deep weariness in the animal's gaze. Martha had just nodded. Another broken thing to care for. She climbed down from the wagon, her joints stiff. The key the lawyer had given her was heavy and ornate, a piece of city brass that didn't belong here. It grated in the lock, the sound loud in the quiet woods. The door swung inward on a single protesting hinge, opening into a dusty gloom. One room. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a cot in the corner with a neatly folded blanket. It was the cell of a monk, not the home of a man. Everything was clean, obsessively ordered. Tools hung on the wall in perfect alignment. A stack of books sat by the cot, their spines straight. It was the room of someone who had nothing left but control over the small things. Gunner limped past her, his claws clicking on the floorboards. He went straight to the cot, sniffed the blanket, and let out a soft, guttural moan. He circled once and lay down, his head on his paws, facing the door. He was waiting. Martha stood in the doorway, the afternoon light cutting a dusty swath across the floor. She felt nothing. No grief for the brother she barely knew, no hope for a new beginning. She had come to the end of the line, and it looked exactly as she'd expected. A quiet room, a waiting dog, and the vast, indifferent wilderness pressing in from all sides. The first week was a ritual of silence. Martha moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone with nowhere to be. She cleared the lean-to, stacked the firewood Frank had already cut, and patched the worst of the holes in the roof with shingles she found in a small shed. She worked from dawn until dusk, seeking the clean exhaustion that might quiet the low hum of memory. It never did. In the evenings, she would sit at the rough table, cleaning her rifle, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. Gunner would lie by the hearth, even when there was no fire, his one good eye tracking her movements. He ate what she gave him without enthusiasm and spent most of his time sleeping or staring at the cabin door. He was an animal steeped in his own form of grief, and she respected its borders. She spoke to him sometimes, her voice rusty from disuse. Just as now, old boy, he would lift his head, his ears twitching, then lay it back down with a sigh that seemed to come from the center of the earth. She explored the 40 acres, walking the perimeter Frank had marked with blazed trees. It was hard country, more rock than soil, thick with lodgepole pine and fir. A creek cut through the northern edge, the water cold and fast. It was a good place to disappear. She found no sign that Frank had done anything but that. No fields cleared for planting, no traps set for game. He had simply existed here, leaving as little mark as possible. By the second week, a pattern began to emerge in the dog's behavior. Each morning, after their silent meal of dried meat and hardtack, Gunnar would stand up, stretch his stiff hind legs, and walk to the back of the cabin. He would stop over a particular section of the floor, near the small door that led to a shallow root cellar. He would lower his head, sniff intently at the cracks between the wide pine planks, and then look back at her. The first few times, she ignored it. An old dog's habits, a scent of mouse or rot. But he was persistent. Every day, the same spot. He would nudge the floorboard with his nose, then let out a low, insistent whine. On the 10th day, his insistence changed. He began to paw at the board, his claws scraping against the wood. It wasn't a frantic or destructive motion, it was purposeful. He would scratch twice, then look at her, his brown eye sharp with an intelligence that went beyond simple instinct. It was a communication. "He wants you to look," she murmured to herself, wiping her hands on her trousers. She walked over and knelt, the floorboards cool beneath her knees. She ran her hand over the plank Gunnar had indicated. It felt no different from the others. But when she pressed down on the far end, it gave slightly, a fractional dip the others did not have. She looked at Gunnar. He sat back on his haunches, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the floor. He was waiting for her to understand. She went to the hearth and returned with a long iron poker. Working the tip into the seam, she pried gently. The wood groaned. The nails, she saw, had been countersunk and covered with a mixture of dirt and pitch, expertly camouflaged. With a final heave, the board came loose with a dry screech. Beneath it was not dirt and joists, but a hollow space, dark and still. The air that rose from it was cool and smelled of oiled metal and dry paper. And nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy, black metal box, about the size of a boot box, with a tarnished brass lock. Gunnar nudged her hand with his wet nose, his message clear. Here. This is what he had been trying to show her. This was the start. The lock was sturdy, not something a simple tool could bypass. Martha carried the box to the table, its weight surprising her. It was heavier than it had any right to be. She studied it in the grey light filtering through the window. There was no keyhole, but a complex series of small tumblers set in a circle. A combination lock. She tried to force it, using the poker as a lever, but the metal was thick and did not yield. Frustration, a feeling she hadn't felt in months, pricked at her. Gunnar rested his chin on her knee, letting out a soft rumble. She looked from the box to the dog, then around the obsessively ordered cabin. A man like Frank, a man who organized his tools by size and kept his books in a perfect stack, would not leave something to chance. The combination would not be random. It would be here. Somewhere. She began a systematic search of the cabin. It felt like a violation, picking through the last remnants of her brother's solitary life. The books by his cot were classics, Shakespeare, Marcus Aurelius, a worn Bible. Inside the Bible, tucked into the pages of the Book of Job, was a folded piece of paper. On it, in Frank's neat, precise hand, was a series of numbers. The 22nd of October, 18, her breath caught. Their father's birthday. October 22nd, 1818. A date from a shared past she thought Frank had discarded along with the rest of his family. She returned to the box, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked the small, stiff dials. She turned the first to 22, the second to 10, the third to 18. A faint click echoed in the silent room. She lifted the heavy lid. The scent of old money and ink washed over her. The box was packed tight. On top lay a thick leather-bound ledger. Beneath it, bundled in paper strips, were stacks of banknotes. Not gold coin, but crisp paper currency issued by the United States Treasury. She lifted one bundle. The denomination was $50. There were dozens of such bundles. A fortune. Enough to buy a dozen ranches, to start a new life anywhere. Her first thought was a cold, sinking certainty. Her brother was a thief. All those years of silence, the shame her father felt over his disappearing son, it was all for this. Frank had run off, robbed a bank or a train, and hidden himself away in the wilderness to live on his spoils. The image of her quiet, bookish brother morphed into that of a common outlaw. The emptiness in her chest was suddenly filled with a bitter, familiar disappointment. Tucked beside the money was a small journal, its cover identical to the ledger's. She opened it. The first page was dated 20 years prior. The handwriting was Frank's, but it was shaky, frantic. "They're dead. All of them. Weston shot them down. He shot me, too, but the bastard missed anything vital. I have the ledger. He thinks I have the gold, but it was never my detail. I have to run. He will tell them I did it. He will tell them I killed them and took the army payroll. My name is forfeit. My life is forfeit. All I have is the proof." Martha's blood ran cold. Army payroll. She looked at the money in the box, then back at the journal. This wasn't the payroll. The payroll would have been gold specie, not banknotes. This was something else. She began to read, the story of her brother's lost 2 decades unfolding in neat, measured script. She read for hours, the light fading outside the window until she had to light a lantern. The journal detailed a life lived in the shadows. Frank had not been a thief. He had been an agent for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by the Army to provide supplemental security for a massive gold shipment, a payroll for all the forts in the territory. His partner, a man named Weston, had betrayed them. Weston was in league with a powerful local rancher, a man named Corbin, who had orchestrated the whole affair. They had ambushed the transport, killed the soldiers, and taken the gold. Weston, a former Army officer himself, had pinned the entire crime on Frank, the quiet outsider. A federal warrant was issued for Frank's arrest for robbery and murder. He had escaped the ambush, wounded, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the accounting ledger that Weston had foolishly left behind. The ledger was the key. It was Corbin's private record, detailing the bribes, the network, the entire criminal enterprise, all leading up to the heist. It was the one piece of evidence that could bring the whole thing down. For 20 years, Frank had been hunted. He had lived under assumed names, working odd jobs, always moving, until he found this isolated piece of land. Here, he had prepared. The money in the box was his life savings, painstakingly gathered, a fund for whoever came after him. A contingency. He wrote of his regret, of the life he couldn't live, the family he couldn't contact for fear of leading Corbin's men to them. He wrote of his slow decline, a sickness in his lungs taking hold, and the grim realization that he would not live to see justice done. "I have made contact," a late entry read. "There is a man, a marshal, who believes me. He has been working the case from the inside for years. But we need more. We need Corbin to move. He has never stopped looking for this ledger. He believes I know where the gold is hidden. If I die, he will come for whoever inherits this place. That will be the trap." A knock on the door made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. Gunner was instantly on his feet, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. He stood between Martha and the door, his body rigid. A man's voice called out. It was calm, polite. "Deputy Sheriff. Just making my rounds. So your wagon. Wanted to make sure everything was all right out here." Martha's mind raced. A marshal, who believes me. Could this be him? Or was it one of Corbin's men, testing the waters? She moved to the door, the journal heavy in her hand. "Everything's fine, Deputy," she called back, her own voice tight. "Just getting settled. Mind if I have a word?" It's a long ride back to town. The request was reasonable, but it felt loaded with unspoken intent. She looked at Gunner. The dog had not relaxed, but his growl had subsided to a low hum. She slid the bolt. The man on her porch was tall and lean, with a weathered face and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a dusty coat over a simple shirt, a star pinned to his vest. He looked more like a range rider than a lawman. "Name's Reed," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes flicked past her, into the cabin, lingering for a fraction of a second on the open box on the table before meeting her gaze again. He hadn't missed it. "Heard Frank passed. Sorry for your loss." He was a quiet man. "Kept to himself, we weren't close," Martha said, her tone flat. It was the truth, but now it felt like a lie. "That's an old dog you've got there," Reed said, his gaze shifting to Gunner. "Faithful animal. Frank trained him well," the words hung in the air. Trained him well. It wasn't a casual observation. It was a test. "His good company," Martha replied, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Is there something I can help you with, Deputy?" Reed's gaze was steady. "Just wanted to let you know you're not entirely alone out here. This can be hard country. People get ideas. If you see or hear anything that doesn't feel right, you send word into town. Ask for me." He was telling her something. Warning her. Confirming Frank's plan without saying a word. "I'll remember that," she said. He nodded once, a sharp, professional gesture. "Good day." He turned and walked back to his horse, his stride unhurried. Martha watched him ride away until he was swallowed by the trees. She closed the door and slid the bolt home. Her brother hadn't been a thief. He had been a soldier in a war she never knew he was fighting. And he had just handed her his rifle. The deputy's visit shattered the cabin's fragile peace. The silence was no longer empty, it was waiting. Martha felt a shift inside herself, the dull edges of her grief sharpening into something else. Anger. And a cold, clear purpose. Her brother had not run from a crime, he had run to protect a truth. He had died a lonely, anonymous death to keep that ledger safe, to give justice a final, desperate chance. He had trusted her, the sister who had long ago written him off, to understand. She went back to the journal, but this time she read the final entries, the ones written in a fading, spidery script as Frank's strength gave out. Corbin is old now, but his nephew, Tate, is running things. The boy is reckless, arrogant. He's the weak link. If Corbin thinks the ledger is here, he will send Tate. He will not risk coming himself unless he has to. That will be your advantage. He had laid it all out. A strategy. A battle plan conceived by a dying man. He described another hidden space, this one in the wall behind the wood stack next to the fireplace. Martha moved the split logs, her hands dusty with bark. A section of the stone chimney was loose. She worked her fingers into the cracks and pulled. A heavy, slate-gray stone came free, revealing a dark cavity within the chimney structure. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against oiled canvas. She drew it out. It was a rifle, a Sharps 1874 long range, a buffalo gun. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, and impeccably maintained. Beside it were 2 boxes of heavy-caliber cartridges and a small, sealed oilskin pouch. She broke the seal on the pouch. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a final letter. "Martha, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the wolves are at the door. I am sorry for the silence. It was the only way to keep you safe. The man you met, Reed, is U.S. Marshal Reed. He is the only law in this territory you can trust. The rest are on Corbin's payroll. Reed has been building a federal case, but the ledger is the linchpin. Without it, Corbin walks free. With it, his entire empire collapses. Corbin's men will come. They will not be gentle. They think you are a lone woman, an easy target. Let them. In the root cellar, behind the west wall, is a tunnel. It leads to the creek bed a quarter-mile north. It is your way out. Take the ledger and go. Give it to Reed. That is all I ask. My life has to have meant something. Your loving brother, Frank." She held the letter, her brother's words a physical weight in her hand. Take the ledger and go. It was a reasonable command. A sensible escape. She could run, hand off the burden, and disappear. It was what she had been doing for the last year. But as she looked at the rifle in her lap, at the sleeping dog who had led her to this precipice, she felt the old, familiar drift of her life finally hit solid ground. She had been running from a ghost, the memory of a husband she couldn't save. Frank had run toward a purpose, a justice he couldn't live to see. Running was not an option. Not anymore. She owed him this. She owed it to the man who had died alone in this cabin, believing she would be strong enough. A faint sound, carried on the wind, made her freeze. Gunner's head snapped up, a low growl starting deep in his chest before it even registered to her own ears. It was the jingle of harness, the thud of hooves on soft earth. More than one horse. Coming fast. She moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders were breaking through the tree line, moving with a confident, predatory arrogance. The man in the lead was young, handsome in a cruel way, with a fine hat and a silver-inlaid gun belt. Tate Corbin. Her brother's battle plan had just become her reality. The riders fanned out, circling the cabin like vultures. Gunner stood beside Martha, his body a rigid line of fury, the fur on his spine raised. He didn't bark, just maintained that deep, vibrating growl, a promise of violence. "Hello, the house," the young man, Tate, called out. His voice was smooth, laced with an insolent charm. "We're looking for the lady of the property." "Just want to have a friendly chat." Martha remained silent, her hand resting on the stock of the Sharp's rifle. It felt solid, an extension of the resolve hardening within her. She was not the grieving widow in the wagon anymore. She was Frank's sister. "No need to be shy," Tate called again, a thread of impatience entering his tone. "My uncle, Mr. Corbin, sends his regards. He had a business arrangement with the late Mr. Franklin. We're just here to collect what's owed." They were making no pretense. They believed she was ignorant, helpless. She slid a heavy bolt across the door and checked the bar on the back shutter. The cabin was small, but it was built like a fort. Frank had built it that way for a reason. Night was coming, her greatest ally. In the fading light, she moved with quiet efficiency. She propped the heavy table against the main door. She took one of the boxes of cartridges and laid them out on the small mantelpiece where they would be within easy reach. The ledger and Frank's journal she wrapped back in their woolcloth and tucked deep inside the chimney cavity, replacing the stone. Whatever happened, they had to be safe. Gunner moved from the window to the door, a living sentinel, his senses far sharper than her own. He would be her ears. "Last chance, lady." Tate's voice was ugly now, the charm gone. "We know he left it here. A ledger. Maybe some other things. Give it to us, and we'll ride out. We won't even bother you again." The lie was so bald it was almost insulting. They would take the ledger and leave no witnesses. A shot splintered the wood of the door, the sound cracking through the twilight stillness. Gunner flinched but didn't bark. He looked at Martha, his one good eye asking a question. "Not yet, boy," she whispered, her voice steady. She wasn't a killer. She hadn't fired a gun at another human being in her life. But she had spent her youth tracking game in the high mountains with her father and Frank. She knew how to be patient, how to wait for the right shot, how to use the land. Frank had called Tate reckless. She would use that. She moved to the small window on the cabin's west side, the one that overlooked the thickest part of the woods. The sun had set, and the forest was sinking into a deep, moonless dark. One of the men was dismounting, moving toward the side of the cabin, keeping low. He thought he was being stealthy. He didn't know about the bed of dry leaves and twigs Frank had allowed to accumulate there. A natural alarm. She waited, her breathing slow and even. The Sharp's was heavy. She rested the long barrel on the windowsill, the metal cold against her skin. A twig snapped. Then another. The man was close. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for the ground just in front of his feet. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle boomed, the recoil a solid punch against her shoulder. A gat of dirt and rock erupted where she'd aimed. The man yelled, a cry of shock and pain as stone fragments peppered his legs, and he scrambled back into the darkness. One down. Not dead, but out of the fight. "Damn you, woman!" Tate screamed from the front of the cabin, his voice a mixture of fury and surprise. They had expected a sheep. They had found a wolf. The night deepened, a thick blanket of blackness that swallowed the forest. The initial chaos from her first shot had subsided into a tense, watchful silence. Tate and his remaining man were smarter now. They weren't moving. They were waiting her out. Martha knew this was a battle of nerves. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, the heavy rifle across her knees. Gunnar lay beside her, his head on her lap. His warmth was a comfort, a living anchor in the suffocating tension. Every few minutes, his ears would swivel, tracking a sound she couldn't hear, the scurry of a night creature, the whisper of wind in the pines, or the shift of a man's weight in the darkness. He was her early warning system, Frank's last and most loyal soldier. She thought about the tunnel. Escape was still an option. She could slip out, make her way to the creek, and be gone before they knew it. But the image of her brother's neat, lonely room, of his final, desperate hope, held her fast. To run would be to let him die a second time. She was no longer just Martha. She was the custodian of his legacy, the instrument of his posthumous will. Her past life, the woman who grieved by a bedside, felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. That woman was soft and lost. This woman, the one sitting in the dark with a rifle and a dog, was made of harder material. An hour passed. Then another. A faint scraping sound came from the back of the cabin, near the root cellar. Gunnar's head came up, a low growl starting in his throat. Martha put a hand on his neck, silencing him. She crept to the rear wall, listening. They were trying to pry the shutter off the small window there. It was a foolish move. The window was too small for a man to climb through easily, and it would leave him exposed. She waited. The scraping stopped. A moment of silence, then the splintering of wood as they used to pry bar. The shutter gave way with a groan, falling to the ground outside. A dark shape appeared in the opening, a man's head and shoulders silhouetted against the slightly less black night. He was trying to peer into the gloom of the cabin. Martha didn't fire. She grabbed the heaviest piece of firewood from the stack by the hearth, a dense, knotted log of oak. She moved to the side of the window, flattened herself against the wall, and waited. The man, emboldened by the silence, began to hoist himself up. He got one arm and his head through the opening. In that moment, Martha swung the log with all her strength. The impact was a sickening thud. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and fell backward out of the window, disappearing from view. She heard him hit the ground and lie still. Now it was just Tate. She could hear him cursing, his voice thin and ragged in the vast darkness. He was alone, his men taken out by a lone woman he had underestimated. His arrogance was turning to fear. She had to press the advantage. She moved to the front door, listening. Nothing. He was likely hiding behind the trees, trying to decide his next move. She had an idea, a risk. She took the lantern, lit it, and placed it on the table, making sure it cast her shadow against the west wall, away from the front door. Then she unbarred the door. She didn't open it. She just waited, the Sharp's rifle ready. The silence stretched. Gunnar stood beside her, utterly still. Then, a new sound. An engine. No, not an engine. Horses. A carriage, moving fast. It wasn't the slow, cautious pace of a threat. It was the confident rhythm of a rival. A new player had entered the game. The carriage pulled up with a jingle of harness and a spray of gravel. A man's voice, older and colder than Tate's, cut through the night. Tate! What is the meaning of this fiasco? Heavy footsteps approached the cabin. This was Corbin. The mastermind. The man her brother had hidden from for 20 years. He had come himself. Frank's prediction had been right, the reckless nephew had failed, forcing the old wolf from his den. "Uncle, the woman, she's armed." She took out Ben and Marcus. Tate's voice was a pathetic whine. "Get out of my sight," Corbin snapped. The air went still again. Martha could feel the man's presence outside the door, a palpable aura of menace and authority. He was used to getting what he wanted. He knocked. Not a timid rap, but a firm, commanding summons. "This has gone on long enough. My name is Alistair Corbin. My nephew is an idiot, for which I apologize. I am a reasonable man. Open the door. Let us talk." His voice was cultured, smooth as polished stone. The politeness was more threatening than Tate's raw anger. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise his. Martha's heart was a cold, steady drum. This was the moment. The culmination of her brother's long wait. She looked at Gunnar. The dog was staring at the door, his lips pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. "There's nothing to talk about," she called out, her voice betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "This is my property." Leave. A dry chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Your property?" "This land, that cabin, everything your pathetic brother owned was paid for with a debt he owed me. I am here to collect. Now, you can give me the ledger he stole, and I will give you $500 and a day's head start. Or I can have my men burn this cabin to the ground with you and that dog inside it. The choice is yours." The threat was plain, unadorned. He believed he held all the cards. Martha took a deep breath. She thought of Frank's final letter. He will not risk coming himself unless he has to. He was here. He was exposed. It was time to spring the trap. She made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she drew the heavy bar from the door. She cocked the hammer of the Sharp's rifle, the click deafening in the small room. Then she kicked the door open. Alistair Corbin stood on the porch, a silhouette against the darkness. He was older, dressed in a fine city coat, but he was not soft. He held a pistol in his hand, and his eyes were cold and reptilian. He had been expecting her to surrender. He had not been expecting her to open the door with a buffalo gun leveled at his chest. His surprise lasted only a second. He raised his pistol. But in that same second, Gunnar launched himself from the shadows. He was not a young dog anymore. His back legs were weak. But his heart was that of a warrior. He hit Corbin in the chest, a blur of fur and fury, his jaws snapping for the man's gun hand. The pistol went off, the shot going wild, splintering the roof of the porch. Corbin yelled, stumbling backward, trying to fight off the dog. It was the opening Martha needed. But before she could act, another sound tore through the night. A whistle. Sharp and clear. And then, from the trees on all sides, the thunder of hooves. Riders burst into the clearing, not Corbin's men, but a dozen figures, grim and purposeful. At their head was Marshal Reed. Alistair Corbin, Reed's voice boomed, carrying the weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for robbery, conspiracy, and the murder of United States soldiers." Corbin froze, his face a mask of disbelief. He shoved Gunnar away, the old dog falling to the porch with a yelp of pain. Corbin stared at Reed, then at Martha, his cold eyes finally understanding. He had not walked into a negotiation. He had walked into a meticulously planned ambush, 20 years in the making. Frank had won. The aftermath was a blur of controlled, professional activity. Marshal Reed's men rounded up a stunned Tate Corbin and the two injured hands. Alistair Corbin stood rigid as Reed himself put him in irons, his cultured mask finally cracking to reveal the snarling animal beneath. "The Pinkerton ghost," Corbin spat, his eyes locked on Martha. "He beat me." From the grave, Martha's attention was only on Gunnar. The old dog lay on the porch, his breathing shallow. She knelt beside him, running her hand over his flank. There was no blood. The fall had just been too much for his old bones. He whined softly and tried to lift his head. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice thick. "Easy now." Reed walked over, his face grim. "Is he?" "He's just old," Martha said, not looking up. The fight took the last of what he had. Reed knelt beside her. "Your brother was a hero. He saved my career. I was a rookie assigned to the payroll detail. I was the only other survivor of the ambush, left for dead. Everyone thought I was in on it. Frank found me, got word to me. For 20 years, we worked on this. He was the ghost, digging up the proof. I was the man on the inside, waiting for the moment. The ledger was the key. We knew Corbin would never stop looking for it." He looked at the cabin, at the quiet orderliness of the place. "Frank's plan was for you to run. To get the ledger to me. He never would have wanted you in the line of fire. He knew I would stay," Martha said softly. It was true. Deep down, the brother she thought a stranger had known her better than anyone. He had known the steel that was buried under her grief. He had counted on it. Gunnar nudged her hand, his one good eye looking up at her. He had done his duty. He had protected his master's legacy and his master's sister. He had seen the mission through to the end. The resolution came not in a single, triumphant moment, but over the slow course of the following months. Marshal Reed and a team of federal prosecutors used Frank's ledger to systematically dismantle Corbin's empire. Indictments came down across the territory. Bankers, sheriffs, land agents, all of them fell like dominoes. The trials were held in Helena, and the newspapers called it the biggest criminal conspiracy in the history of the frontier. Frank's name was publicly cleared. He was honored posthumously by both the Pinkerton Agency and the U.S. Army. His story, the story of the silent, patient man who gave his life to hunt a monster, became a quiet legend in the territory. Martha did not attend the trials. Her work was done. She stayed at the cabin. She used some of the money from the box, Frank's contingency fund, to have the place properly repaired. A new roof, a sturdy porch, glass for the windows. She bought a milk cow and a few chickens. She didn't need a fortune. She just needed a home. Gunnar survived the night, and the next, and the one after that. He never regained the full strength of his back legs, but his spirit was undimmed. He would lie on the new porch, his head on his paws, watching her as she worked in the small garden she had planted. The emptiness in Martha's chest had not vanished. Grief, she was learning, does not simply disappear. It changes shape. It becomes a part of the landscape of a life, like a mountain or a river. But it was no longer a hollow ache. It was a quiet, solid weight, a foundation. Her brother's memory, her husband's love, the ghost she had carried for so long, were now just part of the soil from which her new life was growing. One cool autumn evening, she sat on the porch steps, oiling a piece of harness. The sun was setting, painting the pines in hues of orange and deep purple. Gunnar rested beside her, his head in her lap. The silence was no longer waiting. It was peaceful. She had arrived at the end of the line only to find it was a beginning. Victory wasn't a celebration. It was the quiet continuation of a life that had found its purpose.